Good morning, everybody. What I'm about to do now will be grossly inadequate, so bear with me. I want to begin by thanking Yothyu Yindi Foundation for an extraordinary Garma. I'd imagined that the 3-year hiatus would have meant it would have been extremely difficult to crank up to where it left off 3 years ago, and that the acceptances might have dribbled in rather than be swamped by acceptances. So obviously there was a pent-up demand for another one of these conferences, and what a success it's turned out to be. And I said to Sean this morning, I can't imagine the difficulty in keeping those balls in the air like Denise and he and Jawa have done, but what an enormous effort. Thank you. I then want to thank the Gumatj Association for the vision of 25, 30 years ago to bring on something like Garma. I realise the ancient history to this site and how it lent itself to such gatherings in the past before the advent of European migration to the country, and how it's been a natural progression into what we have today. But who could have foreseen that through Yolngu eyes? Well, they did, and look what an amazing success it is. It is now on the world map as the foremost institution of this kind. I'm quite certain of that. And I mentioned 4 years ago how it creates a fire in my belly to aspire to better things in life. And, you know, it's been, nutrition to my soul, and it keeps me enthused. And I'm a bit like the ex-boxer who's ringside during a championship fight. You know, I'm supposed to be retired from Aboriginal affairs, but it never happens. It's in your system, and you rock and roll with the punches, and you throw one when you shouldn't, and it's a bit like Monica watching rugby league on TV. She runs up at the screen and accuses the umpire of all sorts of things. So, Gumatj Association vision extraordinary. But they in turn were informed by the DILAC that sits behind that, the wider gathering of very powerful people, male and female, and an extraordinary acknowledgement of their continued occupation of this corner of the world, uninterrupted, with all strength to their arm, and the capacity to draw people here like no other site in the country can draw people to it. Thank you to them. When I saw the theme for this conference, my mind rolled back over my thinking of past years, and I went back to some words I used in a presentation in an Eric Johnson lecture of 2013, and I put my thoughts in the context of future development of the Northern Territory, not just Yolngu. And the Territory, obviously, in my mind, won't achieve its potential until the Yolngu segment, the Indigenous First Nations segment of that population, takes its rightful place in the economy. It isn't there now. It's a long shot from being there now. We're told that about a third of the population is Yolngu. First Nations, that's adults. If you move down through the age groups, you're looking at in excess of 40% of primary school-aged children, an increasing proportion. So it's quite obvious that the potential of the Territory will not be realised until First Nations people are taking a rightful spot in the real economy, not the gammon economy of the welfare side of Australia. So when you look to who might contribute to the achievement of that potential, you can't always ascribe blame to governments. I think there are various obstacles that need to be overcome, and I've listed a few up there, and it might be difficult to read from the rear of the room. But some of those responsibilities fall to government, and others fall squarely to First Nations people. And some of the responsibilities represent the elephants in the room, represent don't mention the war, take us beyond our comfort zones, but nevertheless need to be addressed. And I'm talking about things like the way royalties are distributed. You know, royalties have acted in a way, in my mind, as a further disincentive to engagement in the real economy, to engagement in the workforce. I'm thinking about school absenteeism, and we've seen some wonderful things here with Barker Dupama, and I wish that were replicated in the remote desert schools, where attendance records are as low as 20 and 30%. And I despair for the future of those kids. They will never, ever achieve their rightful place in employment because they are simply not equipped for it. They're destined to be second-class citizens for life. And that's a serious concern. You know, for somebody that's spent 50 years in the game, I can't see that as much of an achievement in my part. 30% absenteeism rates, kids coming out at the end of the school basically illiterate. And then you go on to jobs, enterprises, household incomes. And I look at land tenure. We were told proudly that 55% of the land mass in the Northern Territory is now Aboriginal land. Certainly, that 55% was left over after all the cattlemen and miners had their pick. But nevertheless, that 55% isn't yet contributing to the improvement of household incomes, which in turn will be a direct factor in closing the gap that people talk about. I think land councils have mentioned some aspirational work now on bringing Aboriginal land into production, into wealth generation. Well, I look forward to that, because disproportionately that land isn't producing now, and I include all of the cattle properties that were acquired over time to improve wealth generation in remote communities. They've fallen away from cattle production. And I think there needs to be some very serious introspection about how that land mass can be utilised to bring people into the real economy. I think too about the loss of national representative bodies for First Nations people, and I've listed the history of those involvements up there in the past. But I quickly go on and remind people of the talk that's occurred here over the last few days about a voice, a treaty, a truth-telling session. So we're rapidly moving towards addressing that vacuum of a national voice for Indigenous people. And I commend the work of the Prime Minister. I was absolutely amazed the other day at not only the content of his speech, which shows that somebody somewhere understands the issues and the nuances, and it was all addressed in that speech, and I thought the Prime Minister's delivery to it showed personal commitment and complete understanding. And I gave them, 110% on content and on delivery, and I'm a bit of a cynic and a cranky old man, as we've been told. I look forward to that development. I see some pitfalls, and there's no doubt the Prime Minister sees those pitfalls himself. The key one is allegedly a lack of detail, but in relation to other legislative proposals, you don't spill the detail of the legislation out before you've agreed the principle, and his argument is you agree the principle and the detail can come later. But given the ability of social media these days to find a niche and drive Mack trucks through that niche, I can already picture the fear-mongering that's going to come through social media by the ultra-right-wingers, if not from this side of the world, then the other, that's going to white ant this process. But if I can see that, then surely those people around Albanese can see it much more clearly than me and will develop their defences against it. For my part, I simply ask myself the question, am I comfortable with the fact that we never concluded a treaty with First Nations? Am I comfortable with a group of bearded old men, the grandees, sitting around a comfortable table, probably smoking their pipes around 1900, drafting a constitution that made no reference whatsoever to the first occupants? Am I comfortable that the original occupants of the country were airbrushed from history by Cook's communications back to England? Did Cook lie? I think the evidence is there that he did. I think this country was occupied on a false premise, a legal lie, which was rectified in part by the Barbo decision of the High Court. But there's more work to be done to work on the souls of Aboriginal people who still suffer an extreme indignance at the idea that somebody like Captain Cook could plant a flag and say this is the King of England's country. How absurd. Think about it for a minute. Absolutely absurd act. An old mate of mine, Burnham, went to England and he hired a rowboat and he rowed into Dover and he had the media set up, and Burnham arrived on the beach and planted a flag and claimed it for Australia. And the Pommies weren't interested. Well, it was precisely the same act. I've mentioned in there as some of the responsibilities that fall to First Nations people. Family violence. You know, we tempt to want to airbrush that away too because it makes people uncomfortable. But the incidence of Aboriginal on Aboriginal violence is at horrendous levels. Charlie King has mounted a no more campaign now for many, many years. And I think at one point he thought he was being successful, but then events of the last couple of weeks have arisen in Alice Springs and Catherine, and it sets the depression in again. So there is some serious work needed there. First Nations people have a number of issues that they need to address, and I suppose they don't really need me to tell them about that, but I've mentioned them here for balance because otherwise it might take on the appearance that I'm forever condemning governments without acknowledging that they have a role to play in this too. But I'll condemn governments all right. Because past debates in this room, Sean succinctly assessed. On the one level, it was me arguing that the share of money that the Territory government got from the Commonwealth was inadequate. And Barry's argument basically was that that money that the Northern Territory government got hold of was misspent. And we were both right. My argument basically was that the way the GST was cast did an injustice of the Northern Territory. The GST is basically designed to allow each jurisdiction to deliver an average level of services. It's loaded on the basis of small population, large land mass, highly spread through the bush, a disbursement of population unlike any other state. 70% of our Indigenous population live in the bush. 70% of the Indigenous population in the states live in the cities. A vast contrast. And it obviously involves a lot more money to deliver an average level of services to a widely spread population than it does to a population that's concentrated in a city. But our loading was eroded by the increase in the Indigenous population in the states. It was eroded by some political interference about 5 years ago by the then Treasurer who became Prime Minister, because Western Australia's iron ore royalties dipped and they squealed. And normally we've got our colleague Fred Chaney sitting up here, who by now would be looking daggers at me, being a force of nature from Western Australia. But he's not here, so I've got a free rein. And what the then Treasurer, become Prime Minister, did was interfere with a half-century-old practice of the Commonwealth Grants Commission, which distributed funds to each state and territory on the basis of horizontal fiscal equalisation. It's a term dreamt up by economists. And it simply means according to need. And those needs were small population, widely spread, high Indigenous component. 100% of the pool was distributed on a horizontal fiscal equalisation basis. After Treasurer Morrison's interference with a half-century-old practice, which was the envy of the world, a process of distributing a national collection of revenue to a number of states on an equitable basis, was interfered with. And he put a floor under the share that Western Australia was to get. A minimum of 70 cents in the dollar, 75 cents in the dollar was to go to collected, of GST collected, was to be returned to WA. In layman's terms, that meant 25% of the pool that remained was going to be distributed on a horizontal fiscal equalisation basis. That means a massive dip in the amount of funds that were available to the Northern Territory. And I haven't heard an adequate level of squealing from the Northern Territory government that in any way equated to the squealing of Western Australia when their share dipped. So Western Australia has got this bonus. And iron ore royalties have soared again. Western Australia's is the only state budget this year in surplus. Thank you, Prime Minister Morrison. Every other state had money taken off them to give to Western Australia. And if you think it's paranoia on the part of me or the Northern Territory government, no, not at all. I photocopied an article in The Age in March. Western Australia, the only state to record a budget surplus, 4.4 billion better off than next financial year. Victoria, 1.1 billion out of pocket as a result of those decisions. New South Wales, 1.3 billion worse off. And then he put a floor under the level of revenue that the states would get. This gets a bit complex now, so I won't go into too much detail. A floor for 5 years. And lo and behold, in a major budget deficit situation, the then government borrowed further borrowings to meet that extra cost as a consequence of political decisions to shore up seats in Western Australia leading into the 2019 election. It was a disgusting performance, and it's cost the Northern Territory government and every other state dearly. But because of the high Indigenous population in the Territory, as we've said, 30% adults leading to 40% kids, that led to a higher adjustment to our revenues than any other jurisdiction based on indigeneity, First Nations. So decisions of that kind that interfere with horizontal fiscal equalisation disproportionately disadvantage the Northern Territory, the smallest jurisdiction and the one least capable of withstanding those cuts. And the thing about GST is that it's to deliver an average level of services. There's no capacity there to go back and address the infrastructure backlog at the time of self-government, which remains to this day. So the other part of my exercise in thinking about this Garma presentation was to think about what other source of funds there might be. And there's a few obvious ones. The previous government came up with all sorts of schemes like a community development fund, a sports grant fund, a park and ride fund, all of which have been subject to Australian National Audit Office. Extremely negative reports. And indeed, another one was brought down last Thursday, which I've read online. It's the Building Better Futures Fund. And this is a quote from an online newsletter. The ANAO report shows yet again that the Coalition in general and the National Party in particular weren't just pork barrelers, weren't just up for a little rorting, they were flagrantly corrupt in their handling of public money. My problem is the media didn't appear to be interested in really developing those adverse audit reports, nor did the opposition of the day. And that industrial scale rorting has happened so regularly and repetitively that it's tended to be accepted as the order of the day. And the only hope we've got for the future is the commitment of the Albanese government to the creation of an integrity commission. And I'd like to see that. And I'd like to see the integrity commission given retrospective powers. And if that happened, we've got a bun fight on our hands. Because it would be, and I'll defer to the lawyers in the room here, an extremely interesting point in how far back such an integrity commission might dig and how many former ministers of the Crown might end up in jail. There's quite a few being yarded from the New South Wales former government through such activity, and it's high time the people who rorted public money at the Commonwealth government level were brought to heel too. And those decisions don't quite get to other scandalous things that have happened. And there's just a couple of them there. The list goes on and on. You know, one of the smaller ones was $30 million for the Leppington Triangle, the small pocket of land adjacent to the third airport in Sydney. The other thing that really irritates me, and I am an angry old man, aren't I? The other thing... The other thing that irritates me is that most of the programs that the government creates are so loosely created that you could drive a Mack truck through them. That's an invitation to rorting. And I skipped over that. I'm thinking of childcare, training providers, pink bats, the National Disability or Assistance Program, all of which have been rorted on a grand scale too, billions and billions of dollars. And the way they're administratively structured seems to be an open invitation to the clever dicks to get in and rort, and they've done so with abandon. And it seems to be years on that the government realises, struth, there's money going out the door. And they've closed the door too late. You know, my old mate Charlie Perkins said it's no good of chasing the horse with the gate. And that's what they're doing. 1/3 of Australian largest companies pay no tax. Well, what sort of tax system is that? And yet we're chasing people on the bones of their arse with robo-debt issues. There seems to be a fundamental contradiction there. And Harvey Norman got away with millions of bucks in job creation stuff. Okay, so we realised that there was a need to push money into the economy so that it circulated. Don't give it to him. Give it to a range of other more needy companies. Sorry? Well, what a great idea. Some did, but he didn't. Look, that's enough for me. Sean wants to get on to a question time. Sorry. There's one other thing. I'm so sorry. At previous Garmas, I've mentioned the stunning fact that the Northern Territory has a declining share of the national Indigenous population. That is worsening. The latest census data shows a 25% increase on the Indigenous population from the census before, 25% increase, as against an 8.6% increase, I think, for the general population. What that represents is a category of people that are now generically called box tickers. At one level, I'm extremely pleased that Aboriginal people no longer are reticent about announcing Aboriginality, but at another level, I'm fearful that there's a high proportion of rorters involved in those box tickers too. And it's not only an Australian phenomenon. I've also printed a paper here, white race shifters, white people who identify as Indigenous. It's a Canadian story. So this is a worldwide phenomenon, and it's something that Indigenous people are going to have to encourage the Bureau of Statistics to address by tightening up the census paper that makes it more difficult for people to misrepresent their racial identity and skew the statistics on which the Commonwealth Grants Commission might then use to distribute GST, because this exponential growth in Indigenous population interstate is loading the GST share for those states at the expense of the Northern Territory and draining further money away.